Hello, my name is Eric Wetzel, and I'll be presenting my paper proposal on labor contracts in the early Reconstruction period. I'll go over the topic, a little bit about what the Freedmen's Bureau is. I'll get into my research, going over secondary and primary sources, and then I'll get in a little bit to the mechanics of the paper. Alright, so what is the Freedmen's Bureau? It's a government agency established in 1865 via an act of Congress to provide for the relief of war refugees and newly freed slaves. A major part of this effort was creating labor opportunities for the newly freed slaves, both to gainfully employ them and to keep the Southern economy at large from collapsing. The Bureau would go on to encourage freedmen to engage in labor contracts with Southern plantation owners and businessmen, and we'll see later why this has massive repercussions for labor in the early Reconstruction period. On the right here, we see H.R. 613. This is an act to continue and to amend the practices of the Freedmen's Bureau. Amend is important there because the Freedmen's Bureau goes through multiple challenges, both in the federal government and in state governments, and that causes it to kind of change its practices over time. That's a major subject of this paper. Okay, so let's get to my research question and thesis. My research question is, how did labor contracts for freedmen affect their material labor conditions? What I mean by that is, how are the contracts reflected in reality? Are material conditions for newly freed slaves and laborers better as good as their contracts would suggest, or are they far worse? And my thesis to that is that the Freedmen's Bureau was indeed fighting for labor equality, but they were met with numerous obstacles that kind of prevent those contracts from being realized correctly. This took years to counter, and during these years in which they were countering them in the courts and whatnot, freedmen were still subject to heavy labor exploitation. On the right here, we see a picture of sharecroppers picking cotton in Georgia. This is from the later period, a good bit after Reconstruction, but it still demonstrates how those labor contracts have massive repercussions across Southern labor systems. So I've used a couple of secondary sources for this paper, all relating to labor contracts, labor relations, and the Freedmen's Bureau. They range in age from the 1950s up through the 2010s. I did this intentionally to get an idea of the historiography and see how ideas of labor relations and labor contracts in the South have changed over time. First on the list, we have Martin Abbott's Free Land, Free Labor, and the Freedmen's Bureau. This paper largely criticizes the Freedmen's Bureau as a failure and blames it for the sort of perpetuation of indentured servitude and things like sharecropping in the South. William Cohen's Black Immobility and Free Labor, the Freedmen's Bureau and the Relocation of Black Labor, 1865 to 1868. This was a really good paper explaining sort of the motives of the Freedmen's Bureau. It was indeed to kind of provide refuge for newly freed slaves and other war refugees, but also it was heavily concerned with maintaining some sort of labor market in the South and in addressing like problems of deep unemployment. There were pockets of massive unemployment throughout the South following emancipation. So what the Freedmen's Bureau did, according to this paper, is basically enhance mobility for black labor, and that sort of displaces them over time and also leaves them vulnerable to kind of exploitative business practices that we'll see in things like massive labor contracts for 20, 30 people at a time to work on a plantation. Next, we have Thomas May's Continuity and Change in the Labor Program of the Union Army and the Freedmen's Bureau. This is a really good one. He's talking about, in his intro, the sort of vision in revisionist history of the time, being the 1970s, that everyone's focused on change and what changed during Reconstruction and what was new. And he argues that the focus has shifted away from what kind of facets remain from the antebellum period. And he argues that's possibly more important because they're the factors that would still affect the emancipated peoples. Next up, we have Joe Richardson's The Freedmen's Bureau and Negro Labor in Florida. This paper basically highlights all of the ways that Southerners got around Freedmen Bureau regulations. There's some pretty horrible quotes in it regarding like people's feelings towards black labor at the time. It was inherently valued less than white labor, and Southerners just kind of refused to do the wage labor system, essentially, and reverted to that sort of indentured servitude model we see in the few years following the war. Lastly, we have Martin Roof's Constructing Labor Markets, the Valuation of Black Labor in the U.S. South, 1831 to 1867. This is a sociology paper, so a little bit more divorced from history, but it's super useful nonetheless. They basically compare, as the title would suggest, labor valuation of both slaves and freed slaves, depending on the time period. And what the paper finds is there is a major increase in the value of black labor following emancipation, but this creates issues because the planters don't want to pay the price. So this kind of incentivizes that indentured apprenticeship system that you see following the immediate aftermath of the war. And it's sort of an attempt for the market to, as terrible as it sounds, the market to equalize between what the planters are willing to pay and what the newly freed slaves are willing to accept. And I've also drawn on plenty of primary sources for this paper, honestly too many to list out here in citations, but I've made extensive use of the records of the state assistant commissioners of the Freedmen's Bureau. These are available through places like the National Archives, as well as there's an online database that has most of it transcripted. States that I've mainly focused in on are North Carolina, Tennessee, and Georgia. There's a lot of sort of indenture contract activity in these states that have been transcribed already. A major legal case that kind of came up in my research is In re Ambrose, which is a Supreme Court decision which canceled a series of illegitimate indentures in North Carolina, and that's sort of, further evidence of labor exploitation going on. All right, I want to talk to you a little bit about the mechanics of the paper, how it's going to be outlined. I want to start with an intro. A really great grabber to this paper is the story of Harriet Norwood. She was a 9-year-old orphan girl who in 1866 was indentured by an Army lieutenant to a man to learn the art of housekeeping. From there, I'll go on and give out my research question, thesis, all that good stuff. And then I'd like to get on to the historiography and background, just so the paper is a little grounded and the reader knows what's going on and what I'm talking about. Following that, I'll get into the primary sources, all the stuff from the Freedmen's Bureau commissioners, as well as the In re Ambrose case, and I'll get into my analysis of the primary sources and answering and proving my research question and thesis. After that, I'll get into the conclusion. I'll kind of go back over everything that's been covered in the secondary and primary sources and how it relates to the thesis and how it reinforces it. And thanks for listening to my presentation for my paper proposal on labor contracts in the Reconstruction period.